Well, good day and welcome back. Well, I enjoy typewriter repair videos. I like watching them, especially from Dwayne Jensen of Phoenix Typewriter channel here on YouTube. If you're interested in learning how to fix a typewriter or fix a particular problem in a typewriter, go to his channel. Now, I have done a handful of repair videos, but nothing like what Dwayne Jensen has done on Phoenix Typewriter. He's a professional. I'm an amateur hobbyist who's tinkered somewhat with some of my machines. Having said that, I do try to work on my machines as much as I'm able to. I have in the past relied at times on professional help, either through my local typewriter shop here in Albuquerque, which is John Lewis, or over in Mesa, Arizona with Bill Wall at Mesa Typewriter Exchange. Those are the two that I've predominantly used if I needed professional help. So it's always fun to have a success story, starting off with a problem, working through the trials and struggles of it, and succeeding in the end. That's the kind of a story everybody likes. This video is more about failure, and I think it's important to talk about failure. Just the way life is, we want to talk about success only. So this is about a typewriter repair failure, and maybe there's a silver lining at the end of it. So this is the Olivetti Praxis 48. This is a Type Bar electric typewriter. These typewriters are rather unusual. They don't work like other Type Bar electrics. It does have a motor, of course. It has some drive belts, but it doesn't have the usual kind of a faceted or toothed spindle underneath like the Smith Coronas and all the others use. This is totally different. It's very complicated also. I would say it's as complex as an IBM Selectric, but in a different way. So I got this typewriter over a year, maybe a year and a half ago, and it worked for a while, and then I started having problems with the clutch on, this is an automatic carriage return machine. You push a button either here or here, and it'll do an automatic carriage return. Well, the clutch was slipping and making a loud noise, and the carriage return was slow to return. And I initially made a video, I'll put a link down below, where I was able to put a material with a stronger, grittier, grippier surface, basically sandpaper, that I used double-sided tape and put it on the clutch disc. And that worked for a while, but then the sandpaper wore down and it started doing the same thing. So this summer, I took the machine back on the bench here and started looking at it. And I finally figured out that the cork surface, there's a disc or a ring of cork that's supposed to engage a metal plate. That's the clutch. And the cork was simply worn down and hard. The amount of wear on that cork was so thin, however, that you couldn't buy a sheet cork that thin to put on it. I had some 1/64 inch thick synthetic rubber sheets, very thin. I actually bought it for using as a backing sheet for typewriters. It was an experiment a few years ago. So I cut a ring of this thin rubber and I adhered it to the cork face, and that fixed the slipping clutch. It's very nice and vigorous. The problem is, however, in the process of taking it apart and doing all this work and taking apart the clutch and all that, it developed two other problems. And it's possible that at least one of those problems has been here all along, and I didn't know it because that problem is heat related. So incidentally, the power cords on these Praxis 48s, if you get a machine like this and it's missing the cord, they're almost impossible to find as far as I can tell. They're like as rare as hen's teeth. So this has a US style 2-prong plug on this side, but the actual plug that plugs into the machine is very unusual. And I've heard of other people having to rewire the machine to put one of those 3-prong commercial style sockets like the kind you see on the back of computer monitors or whatever. Anyways, so I'm lucky enough to have the original power cord. So let's get this plugged in and turned on and I'll show you the problem. All right, so I've been using multiple sheets of paper for test typing, and I sort of have this running dialogue of I test the machine, and if it works or doesn't work, I make comments about it. All right, so the basic functionality, backspace works, shifting works. All of these are operated by the power cams. So that's good. And by the way, the backspace is the same cam as the powered carriage return. Okay, so now let's just do let's actually do a carriage return. And that's what it does. That's one of the problems. When you do a carriage return, it moves back quickly to the left margin, but instead of what's supposed to happen is when it hits the left margin, there's a series of linkages that are supposed to trigger that power cam to finish the last 180 degrees of rotation and rotate back to the idle position, and then the machine is at idle at the left margin. But instead of it doing that, there's this grinding, loud grinding noise that happens. So what you have to do to clear it, power it off immediately, hit the margin release key, and then move the carriage all the way to the left, and then you can power it back up, and then you can restore your same line position that you were at before. So the second problem it's doing is once the motor and all that warms up, when you do a carriage return, as it's moving, it will get slow and then stall out. And it looks like the motor stops turning completely. I know there's a clutch down on the motor shaft, but I think the motor itself is stopping. It could either be the motor itself, or there is a capacitor that's designed to ensure the motor turns in the proper direction. So either the capacitor or the motor itself may be going at it. It's thermal, so it might be the bearings or something. Maybe the motor needs to be rebuilt or something. But anyways, when that second problem happens, it doesn't affect the typing. When it's hot, the motor still turns enough to operate the keys, to operate the type bars. So it doesn't inhibit typing. So it's just that it doesn't have enough torque to operate the carriage return. And of course, both of those problems are present at the same time when it's hot. So it'll be really slow to move back when it's hot and maybe stall out. But if it does make it back to the left margin, then that grinding noise happens. So let me show you more of the details underneath the machine. This is the motor shaft. There is a little clutch disc mounted to the shaft, and then there's the pulley, the primary pulley. There's the intermediate pulley with the primary belt and then the secondary belt. These are toothed belts. And the secondary pulley turns this steel round shaft. It's not toothed like the typical drive shaft on a Smith Corona electric, but instead it has a series of power cams. So I have the back 2 feet supported on some tall blocks. They're about 3 inches tall. I have a single block on the front, and this gives me enough room that I can flip the typewriter up on its back and without mangling the power cord or breaking the power cord connector. And then I have another block that'll support the back of the carriage, so I should be able just to flip it back like this, and I can still operate the machine like this, which is kind of cool. So first of all, I wanted to show you how the machine actually types. So the Smith Coronas and those kind of electric typewriters have a rotating, faceted, or toothed spindle. It's like a gear that's really long. The faces, the facets of that spindle interact with the linkages. What happens here on the Smith Corona, it doesn't have a rotating spindle like that. This plate right here will kind of move up like that, and there's another one right back here underneath here. So what I'm going to do is try to tilt this slightly back so the carriage isn't rubbing, and then we'll see how that works. So you notice as we're typing, this guy pivots and the one underneath right there pivots, and those interact with the type R linkages, to do the typing. So not a rotating spindle, it is a totally different mechanism. Okay, so we're looking underneath the machine on the left side. This is the secondary drive belt, and so there is a drive shaft that runs behind this bottom plate. It is a smooth shaft. It's not a toothed shaft. The other end of this shaft connects to the carriage return clutch. There is a toothed gear or cog right here, and then these two curved things, this one here and this one over here, are both power cams. The cam on the right is for the shifting, and the cam on the left here is for backspace and carriage return. Now, the backspace feature does work, interestingly enough, but what happens is this cam is not being triggered to release itself, and that is to rotate the rest of the 180 degrees after the carriage gets back to the left margin after a carriage return. And now you can see this cog is rotating. So we're going to do some shifting. And you can see that right-hand cam rotates. 180 degrees to do the shifting. Okay, now I want to do the backspace, and I have to slightly pull the machine back so the carriage is free to move. So you can see the left-hand power cam does the backspace properly, and then it releases itself. So the main part of that power cam here seems to be working. The problem is when you go to do a carriage return. Okay, now on the right side of that drive shaft, we have this other cam that actually activates the typing when you're typing little characters. And then the shaft ends up on this metal plate here, this disc. And there's a slight gap in there. And this plastic pulley with the cork surface, that is the clutch disc for the carriage return, which that surface is worn down, and I have this really super thin layer of 1/64 inch thick rubber on it, and that actually causes the clutch to work fine now. So that problem is fixed, but I have these other two problems to deal with. So when the automatic carriage return is triggered, that sliding flat plate pulls to the left, which engages the clutch disc with this pulley. Once the clutch disc is engaged, it turns the pulley. The pulley pulls on the draw cord, and the draw cord pulls the carriage to the back to the left margin and also does the line advance. So now for the temperature related problem, I mentioned one possibility could be the motor. This is the motor back here. You can see the rear bearing for the motor right there. It has a cooling fan on the other side of the motor, and this black cylinder is the capacitor for the motor, and that could be a culprit as well for that thermal issue. This plastic bracket in the middle is the power cord bracket, and it is cracked, so I have it secured with a cable tie enough that I can use the plug and it won't move on me. Okay, a couple other parts I want to point out to you just for the sake of clarity. This cylinder back here on the right that you can barely see, maybe I can point the light a little bit better at it. That cylinder is a pneumatic dash pot. When the carriage hits the left margin, it actuates a little dampener, a pneumatic dampener. So if I can move the carriage manually here, the power off, just going to pull the carriage back, you can see this little piston. That gives it a certain degree of dampening so it doesn't slam against the left margin stop too hard. And there is an adjustable air port for that dampener, so you can adjust the dampening of it. So when the carriage is doing its automated carriage return, when it hits the left margin, this little arm moves. Now, that one right there. And that, in turn, through this linkage and the other linkage, what that does effectively is it pushes a plate that you can't really see. So when the carriage hits the left margin, this plate right there slides to the left. And that, in turn, pushes on this other little plate, which transfers the left-hand motion into a motion going toward the front of the machine on the other side of this bulkhead. And there is that little linkage pushing this other plate up toward the front of the machine. Okay, and that plate moving is the plate that slides forward. This is all, again, activated by the carriage hitting the left margin at the end of a carriage return. So the typewriter is currently in the idle position. The carriage return has not been activated, but if it was, that curved arc-shaped face of that moving plate would interact with some of these linkages that would be in slightly different positions, like this one, to trigger the power cam to turn the rest of the 180 degrees and reset itself back to the rest position, which it's not doing. So what happens is there's these intricate little spring-loaded sliding mechanisms and rotating mechanisms, and this L-shaped piece right here, you see there's one for the other cam for the shifting, and those are supposed to trip the little lever on the cam to re-engage the cam with this rotating cog. And that rotating cog engaged with the cam is what rotates the cam back to the rest position, which it's not doing. So it's really hard to see this from your view, but the power cam on the right for the shifting, it engages that cog right along the right edge of the cog. It's not grabbing it in the middle of the teeth, but more toward the very right edge. In the same way with the one for the backspace, it's engaging the teeth of that cog on the very left edge of the cog, which would make you think maybe that's the problem. Maybe the edge of the teeth of the cog are worn down, keeping this plate from engaging. But I have to remind you, the backspace works, and it's using the same cam system. So I think the problem's going to end up being in these little linkages up above here that are supposed to transfer motion from those sliding plates when the carriage hits the left margin. It's supposed to somehow trigger this cam to operate, and it's not doing it. And that's what I haven't been able to figure out. And looking down into this area, you can see all those sliding and rotating plates and springs that actually does the backspace. Here's the backspace, the shifting, and of course, if we try to do the carriage return. So that's the second problem. You got to see the stalling out of the motor when it's hot. So I have to turn it off now, hit the margin release, move the carriage, and then restart it maybe. There it is. So that's the second problem, but it'll still type. Okay, so it's a failure. I have not been able to fix that problem. Well, the two problems, right? Neither of those problems preclude me from using the machine. Using meaning typing, spacing, backspacing. All the features of the typewriter work even when it's hot, even when both problems are present, as long as I don't operate the powered carriage return buttons. So it gives me hope that even though I haven't fixed it, I can still use the machine because everything else works. So the one question I have is, how am I going to keep from accidentally hitting the return key? I was thinking about this, well, maybe there's something in the mechanism I can disable, but I don't want to disable the backspace, right? And they operate on the same cam. And then my wife, the brilliant lady that she is, I was showing her this problem yesterday. It was out on the workbench in the garage, and he goes, why don't you just put something underneath the key so it doesn't move? Yeah, why don't I do that? Okay, so I have a little block of wood from my scraps of wood out in the shop, and it looks like this one is thick enough. So this is the left-hand return key, and both the left and the right-hand return keys are connected to the same linkage. So if you can block the left key from being pushed, it'll also block the right one, or vice versa. So it looks like that might be the right thickness. I just need to cut a piece and stick it in there, and that will disable the return keys without disabling the backspace. So I took a little block of wood, carved it to the right size, colored it black, and I put some of that foamy adhesive double-sided tape on the block. And then I was able to position it underneath the left-hand automatic carriage return button in such a way that it will stop the button from moving but not interfere with any other functions. And so this sad tale of failure to repair this complicated typewriter results in actually me being able to continue to use it. So this is like a failure. It is a failure. I didn't repair it. I didn't return it to its original condition, but I'm still able to use the machine. Maybe not up to other people's standards. If I was to offer this to somebody, either for sale or for a gift, they may not want it because, hey, it doesn't have the automatic carriage return working. But for me, this is such a fast, beautiful operating typewriter that it would be a shame, at least, to dispose of it. So it's a loss, it's a failure, but it's actually a win. So another lesson might be that I could have been so bold as to try to completely disassemble that shaft with the 4 power cams and completely pull it out of the machine and dig down and see what exactly is wrong with it. But in the process of doing so, most likely I would never be able to get it back together to working shape at all. The other lesson here is in knowing your limits is you have to really know when you're digging into something that you can put it back together properly. There's kind of like two mentalities with repairing. There's people that are too timid, either through just their personality or lack of experience or whatever. They don't want to do anything, even the simplest thing, for fear of messing it up. But through experience and knowledge, you begin to learn what your limits are. But the other side of the equation is people that are so self-confident. Oh, I can do that. And they tear it apart and they can never get it back together. So I think it's better to err on the side of being a little more cautious, knowing your limits, but also knowing what the resources are. You have, for instance, Richard Polt's website. I got the online service manual for this that helped me a lot just to understand how it works. But there's also things like the Typewriter Repair Bibles available through Ted Monk's Typewriter Database webpage. Those are great resources. And as I mentioned earlier, Dwayne Jensen's Phoenix Typewriter channel on YouTube is a super useful resource as well. But this machine is rather uncommon. It's not like other electric typewriter machines in the way it functions. So there's not a lot of expertise out there about these machines. I think it's a win. I think me being able to at least restore it back to the shape where I can type on it and I can do a manual carriage return with it, just like I do with the Studio 44 with the broken return lever. I do the same click and pull, twist and pull method. So I'm calling it a win. So as always, this is about creativity, using these wonderful machines for creative writing. I hope you do very well with your creative pursuits. And as always, stay creative and have yourselves a great day. Bye-bye for now.